I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land and waterways on which we gather, and pay our respect to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders, past, present, and emerging. And in tonight's venue, recognize that this group is the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I would also like to offer heartfelt thanks and genuine admiration to the leadership, the voice, the energy, and the vision of all of the staff of BSL, to Trev, and to the amazing team who are at or working alongside BSL, and that includes, I believe, most of you here. Their enduring and determined commitment continually to align with, join forces with, and draw attention to and with the needs of the disadvantaged, and work for lasting change, gives them a unique insight, voice, and credibility to these issues today. And there can be a link between such determination and commitment, which I know many here share and are innovating upon in different ways, and the need to measure poverty visibly and explicitly. If I could have the slides, please. As Miguel Tsekeli in Mexico puts it, a number, like a poverty measure, can awaken consciences. It can mobilize the reluctant. It can ignite action. It can generate debate. It can even, in the best of circumstances, end a pressing problem. Coming up to 50 years after the Henderson Review, a primary reason to measure poverty officially in Australia could be to provide public recognition to distressing situations of disadvantage, because giving them visibility, precision, and recognition could invite new actors, energies, angles of approach that might be creative and effective, many driven by people like our MCs tonight. And they might build the lasting change BSL seeks to summon. Yet BSL and many of you here gathered work on these issues already. How might official statistics on poverty add anything new? Sir Tony Atkinson, a late and beloved scholar who spent his career working on poverty and inequality, wrote his first book on poverty in 1969. His last book was published posthumously in 2019, 50 years apart, just like the 50 years we are coming up to from the Henderson Review. In his last book, With the Wisdom of Hindsight, Atkinson observed that learning about the extent of poverty as academics, students, researchers, it's simply not enough. It is the link with action that marks out poverty measurement from many other subjects of study. Poverty statistics matter because they motivate people to attack a key challenge. Atkinson reminds us that John F. Kennedy in America read Harrington's The Other America, detailing the extent of poverty, right after visiting rural Appalachia. And it motivated Kennedy to roll out a strong anti-poverty program. Looking at the Sustainable Development Goals, the first SDG is to end poverty in all its forms. And Atkinson observed that statistical evidence on poverty has become a stronger influence on political action in the SDG era, precisely because poverty statistics are increasingly recognized as a performance indicator. And as we know, a performance indicator assesses whether or not we're doing what we have decided we want to do. And if I want to get more exercise, it could be my step count. And the performance indicator provides feedback on progress towards our desired goal, and in the case this evening, towards a societal goal. So from Miguel Tsekeli, we learn that poverty statistics make poverty visible and can mobilize the reluctant. And from Tony Atkinson, we recognize those statistics in a political and social context like Australia can seed action and also provide a performance indicator that celebrates even incremental progress. I start here because both understandings of poverty measurement avoid perhaps the most common reaction to the word poverty, which is guilt, if not fear, that a number we cannot change will be used to condemn us. The rest of our time together, I'd like to emphasize that poverty measurement can be a tool for action and for hope. It can show avenues of change, find places that have changed, celebrate what they have done, and clarify what else could follow. And that's what I'd like to explore afterwards. The framework for my work, like the framework of Brotherhood of St. Laurence and many others, has been the work of Nobel laureate Amartya Sen, who alongside sophisticated analyses of economic and social welfare, proposed a way of thinking about poverty and well-being called the capability approach, and used it to discuss very concrete issues of poverty and disadvantage all his life, and in his 90s continues to do so. In listening to and scrutinizing situations of impoverishment, Sen observes there can be coupling of disadvantage, that poor people can experience several at the same time, and this is critically important to consider. And so if measurement is meant to show what Glyn Davis termed of off-ramp out of poverty, then it needs to consider monetary aspects and these multidimensional or overlapping deprivations as well. And these are already being looked at, as we heard from Sarah and Mark and the work of BSL, one by one. But how can they be collected up in an official measure? The other source of inspiration for our work, for BSL work, for others' work, including Sharon Bessel, whose work I've admired and learned from, are the protagonists who are truly the experts on poverty. And in participatory studies in Australia and across the world, in context after context, they explain how poverty is about different challenges that strike them at the same time. And so work on poverty and its measurement must take this perspective, their perspective, and live within it. And Angus Deaton, another Nobel laureate in economics, not that important, observes that even in high-income countries, it's important to complement monetary and multidimensional poverty statistics. So a proposal that Australia measure poverty, a proposal that builds on academics like Sen and Deaton, and most importantly on the protagonists and on organizations who work most closely with them, is a proposal that Australia release 2 official permanent measures of poverty, monetary and multidimensional. A word on language. Poverty may or may not be the right word. You could call it entrenched disadvantage or deprivation. The word needs to be one that imparts dignity and that resonates. I'll call it poverty, but you could change that. So what makes a multidimensional poverty measure, and how can it shape policy? How can it be a cause for hope and make quiet success visible? Now, I have one slide on how to measure because that happens to be my passion. But if you think you need a fancy bit of math and economics to do it, you will be astonished to find that you only need multiplication, something your children or grandchildren could do. So how do you make a multidimensional poverty index? So first, there's a technical and a social conversation about what poverty is that leads to the selection of certain indicators that very imperfectly outline some things to work on first. It's already been going on for some time, so measuring poverty here would be distilling insights that exist. And in parallel with this, geeks and statisticians like us play with the data, make trial measures, and test them to shortlist options that work in plural societies. After you've selected the indicators, then you start with each person and see what of the possible deprivations they actually experience, and collect these together into a deprivation score. And if a person has a critical mass of deprivations, for example, 1/3 or more, they are identified as poor, and otherwise as non-poor. Pretty simple. Once you've identified who is poor, then you can say one thing immediately which journalists love. What is the percentage of the people who are poor? For example, 15%. Among the poor, you next look at the deprivation score, and it's the average deprivation score among all poor people. Let's say that here it is 42%. Now comes the drum roll of fancy measurement. When you multiply these two numbers together, you get a multidimensional poverty index. And here's the trick that moves policy. You obtain the same number if you take every single deprivation of every single poor person, weight them, and add them up. So you can unstack the multidimensional poverty index indicator by indicator and see which deprivations people are experiencing now. And the reason that MPI is motivational is that if any deprivation of any poor person goes down, think of unstacking a stack of plates, the height of the bar, the level of poverty, goes down. It can show changes at once during electoral cycles. So how might this link to action? We're done with measurement. Let's start with the suggestion that Australia might have a monetary and a multidimensional index. And I must remind you that our research group computed a multidimensional index for 110 developing countries, 6.1 billion people, and that SDG 1.1 focuses on monetary poverty and 1.2 on multidimensional poverty. And 84 countries, including 34 high-income countries, report on multidimensional poverty. And 43 of these, 43 others, 3 billion people, have an MPI, a multidimensional poverty index. But why should we use both? Don't they ever overlap? In America, the US Bureau of Census produces a National Multidimensional Deprivation Index, or MDI, and it is an alternative to the official poverty measure, which is income in America. And by the official measure, 12.3% of people are poor, and by the MDI, it's 15%. So we imagine 12.3% are the same, and it's seen a few extra people. But actually, only 8.3% of people experience both. 6.8% of Americans, 21.7 million people, would be experiencing 2 out of the 6 dimensions in America's MPI. And nobody would know. Nobody would care. They would feel invisible. So the MDI makes their condition visible and makes progress tractable. And it shows what deprivations they have and how these change. So the World Bank and UN agencies now recognize that monetary and multidimensional poverty measures complement each other. Think of minions. They have one eye, and some have 2 eyes. If you have 2 eyes, you can see further into poverty. Advisable. So how does an MPI motivate? Let's move to India. India released its baseline MPI, Multidimensional Poverty Index, in 2022, using 2015-16 data, and they updated it in 2023. And what they found is in a period in which they had not yet been using a multidimensional poverty index, MPI had fallen from basically 25% to under 15% in 4.5 years. Well over 100 million people left poverty. The poorest states, districts, caste groups, children reduced poverty the fastest. And all 12 indicators reduced significantly. That's on some of your tables. A number of countries, when they back compute their MPI, find actually they have already been making progress, but they didn't know it. They didn't have a measure that gave them credit for what already happened. I wonder what would happen in Australia. Another country to measure trends, coming back to America, is the need to measure both monetary trends on the bottom of this, the gray, and multidimensional, orange on top. And you say, don't they walk together? You see monetary went down by 3 percentage points and multidimensional by 6 percentage points in 9 years. But you see that little steep portion from 2013 to 2015. The US introduced affordable health care. Monetary poverty couldn't see the benefit, but an MDI could. Next, MPI is a performance indicator. But how can you use it to improve performance? One way is to look where the budget is allocated. When Costa Rica's government looked at the indicators they had decided were public priorities, they found that some indicators that had come up as priorities had zero public expenditure. Ana Elena Chacon, the vice president, was in charge of social policy, and President Solis issued a presidential decree that the budget allocation formula must include multidimensional poverty. He did this during a time of fiscal austerity. So they found areas where there was duplication and cut it and reallocated the money. And on a fixed budget, as you can see, maybe. On a fixed budget, poverty reduction accelerated because of the budgetary adjustments. Another key question in terms of recognition, performance, and motivation, very live in Australia, is to recognize disparities geographically among children or elderly, people with disabilities, and so on. In Panama, the Multidimensional Poverty Index showed that levels of poverty in the indigenous comarcas were shockingly high. The government knew something was wrong, but monetary poverty wasn't showing it. As you see in the poorest comarca in 2019, 93% of indigenous people in that comarca were poor. In Los Santos, it was 4.1%. And 3 years later, Los Santos had come down, but the indigenous comarcas had come down much more. They were catching up, not being left behind. And another group, which is often a focus of attention, is children. In that global multidimensional poverty measure we look at, 1.1 out of 6.1 billion people are identified as living in acute poverty in the developing world. Half of them have not celebrated their 18th birthday, their children. So looking at children is vital, and in every national MPI that has disaggregated by children, they are never less poor than adults, and usually significantly poorer. Now, coming back to practicalities, how does this work very tangibly in offices? The former president of Colombia and Nobel Peace Prize laureate, Juan Manuel Santos, became president in 2010 to a country with a 40-year civil war. And he realized he couldn't build peace without addressing poverty. So in 2011, he launched a multidimensional poverty index, and with management support from the Blair government and McKinsey, used their 15 MPI indicators as key performance indicators, set annual management targets. He formed a roundtable that he personally chaired with 9 ministers who could not send delegates. And they looked at the stoplight, and if their indicator was red, they were asked why. That took incredible political courage, but it worked. Both monetary and multidimensional poverty were cut by 1/3 in 8 years, while the peace accord was being negotiated, signed, and implemented. Santos's OUP book on the subject was published last year, showing how it works in an institutional setting with lots of details down to the grassroots level, 10,000 social officers he called my army. And finally, addressing poverty is not one institution's job. It must be communicated to many different actors, NGOs, private sector, students, local governments. Many hands make light work across generations and communities. So, for example, Santos visited Cali with 39 CEOs of private sector groups in Colombia, and they donned the blue vests of the social officer army and clipboards, and they asked the community members 40 questions inside their homes. And they got exposed to a world perhaps they hadn't had the privilege to experience before. And it made a motivated community to say, what can we do as the corporate sector? Costa Rica, many governments have otherwise found ways and avenues for that engagement. So these are some ways that an official MPI in Australia might be not a heavy bludgeon of despair that cannot change, but a catalyst for action that makes visible and celebrates success. I'd like to conclude in 3 or 4 minutes by hesitantly sharing a toy example on Australia. I'm very nervous to do so with you in the room. I call it a toy example because it doesn't have all the details worked out. And that's deliberate, because to make an MPI for Australia would require many hearts and minds and hands. Sachi Selden and I merely used 8 of the 30 indicators that BSL Social Exclusion Monitor, with thanks to its authors for the code, have developed using the 2022 Hilda survey. And we grouped these into 3 dimensions, equally weighted, and 8 indicators equally weighted within their dimensions of education and skills, employment and health. A person is poor if they're deprived in 1/3 or more of the weighted indicators. And overall, as I showed you at the beginning, 15% of people were poor, and the average intensity was 42%. If you look across the states of Australia, we had to drop the Northern Territories for sample size reasons. The poverty ranges from 6% to 20%. And for the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, 23% were poor compared to 15% otherwise. And the MPI shows even a greater disparity because intensity is higher. This is a bigger disparity than monetary poverty, where 14.4% are poor overall, but 18.4% among the Indigenous. And you can also see a little bit what to do. If you look at the 2 columns on the right-hand side, the big fat ones, you can see that among the First Nations community, the taller bar, the yellow bit of it, little work experience, is much taller than among the short bar next to it, which is everybody else. And so that's clearly a distinct priority, whereas health, the pink stripes, are equally an issue in different communities. So using an MPI, we know who's poorest, we know indicator by indicator what to do nationally, and what might be special needs in different groups. So to conclude, what I've tried to do is to suggest that Australia might consider measuring poverty not to induce guilt, paralysis, or a dread and feeling nothing can be done, but how measures well done together might make visible disadvantages that we already know matter, that we're already working on, and make it visible in ways that can be linked to action that are performance indicators. So I'd like to leave you in closing simply with words of Nelson Mandela. Remember, hope is a powerful weapon.
So, first of all, we might start with Danielle, you and Catherine to get some reactions to Sabina's oration and what she's spoken about tonight. And Danielle, it'd be great to hear from you what you find hopeful in Sabina's message, particularly given the recent report out from the Productivity Commission last month on social mobility, inequality and poverty.
Thank you, Trav, for the kind introduction, and to Brotherhood of St. Laurence for the invite to be here. Look, I think Sabina's key message was hope. And, I mean, the key thing that I took away really was the importance of measurement for driving impact. And I think she provided, a number of very concrete examples of the way in which measurement can inform and then actually drive governments to deliver change. And, where that fits with the sort of the broader work that we did, as you said, we looked at inequality, we looked at social mobility. And the social mobility work in particular, I think, was actually quite a nuanced picture. There was a lot of good news in there. So we studied particularly what we're calling the Zennials, which is the sort of people currently in their early 40s, mid-40s, born at the cusp of Gen X and the millennial generation. And when we look at that group, what we find is about 2/3 of them are earning more than their parents did at the same age. And that partly reflects growth in incomes, generation on generation progress in living standards, and partly social mobility. So, where you are born in the income distribution doesn't necessarily determine where you end up. And we find actually in international comparisons, we are second in the world after Switzerland when it comes to mobility of income. So that was certainly surprising to me and a fairly good piece of news. The less good news to come out of the work was that we see this stickiness at either end of the distribution. And I think tonight we're particularly focused on people in poverty and disadvantage. So in the bottom decile of the income distribution, people are much less likely to move around. And we find that there is a group essentially of households that some households will dip into poverty and most will come out within a year or two, but there is a group that gets stuck. And we had a look at that group and we found that was correlated with many of the broader indicators that Sabina was talking about in her work. If you've got a chronic health condition, if you're renting rather than owning a home, if you're in a regional area, if you have low education levels, all of those things are correlated with being in this group. And we also see that kind of intergenerational persistence. So if you grow up in a household where your parents are on income supports, you are twice as likely to end up on income supports yourself compared to other children. So all of that, says to me that there is a policy problem at the heart of this. We have this broader piece of good news around social mobility, but we do have this problem with entrenched poverty and disadvantage. And, Sabina's presentation says to me that we should have hope that we can shift the dial on that.
Thank you. And for those that haven't seen the Productivity Commission report, highly recommend taking a look. As Danielle says, some really hopeful news in the data, but also some really concerning news about the stickiness. So 1 in 7 Australians in poverty, according to the work that the Commission has done in 2022, and 1 in 10 in persistent poverty. Danielle, maybe a follow-up. I've just come back from a little bit of time in North America visiting organisations focused on poverty reduction, government service delivery, collective impact networks, and one of them said to me, and it kind of captured the sentiment that they thought it was pretty wild that Australia didn't have official poverty measures. What do you think? Do you think it's a problem that Australia, given the hundreds of countries and examples that Sabina gave, doesn't have official poverty measures?
Look, I think it's hard to disagree that it's a problem. I mean, I've certainly sat in rooms where we are trying to talk about poverty and have deep conversations about what's going on, what are the policy levers, and you get sidetracked into a debate about, what's the appropriate percentage of income and should we adjust for housing costs, and, we just spend time kind of trawling over this same ground. So I think, we should be able to arrive on the one measure or maybe the two complementary measures that Sabina's proposing. I think it will help us shift the debate forward if we can get a broad spectrum of agreement across organisations that work in this space, across academics, across policymakers. It gives us a number then to maybe put into the wellbeing framework, and really importantly, as Sabina is alluding to, it gives government something to run at. So I would like to hope that it feels like there's sort of a groundswell for change on this issue, and I would certainly be incredibly supportive of trying to come up with 1 or 2 measures that we can all look to.
Thank you. Catherine, love to hear your reactions to what you've heard from Sabina around multidimensional poverty measurement and what it might mean for the families and children that you work for every day.
Now, Sabina, thank you, is what I'd like to say. That's my original reaction, because one of the things that I have to do is find the language that tells the right story to the right people. And one of the biggest challenges we have is actually getting the story told to the right people and bringing it in a way that's succinct. And sometimes I'm the worst person to do that, because I can find a rabbit hole anywhere and take you down there. I love a rabbit hole, absolutely love rabbit hole. But here's the thing, stories frame how policy lands. And if I were to cut to the chase on it, what you described, of course, is that flat policy results in poor policy. So a flat measure of poverty, poor policy, that's at the heart of it. And the organisation that I work for, SNAICC, it was stood up in recognition that some of the worst policy decisions ever made in Australia related to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, and yet there was no way that we were able to bring a voice forward that said children are a whole. Their families are a whole, and we're targeting the wrong things. We're talking about the wrong things. We're developing the wrong responses. Now, part of that was rooted in those really uncomfortable truths that we have to deal with as Australians, things like the stolen generation, and understanding what the impacts of that have been long term, but also understanding that while the assimilation policies might have moved on, we know that things like poverty, often veiled as neglect, actually are the primary underlying drivers relating to the gross overrepresentation of our children in out-of-home care. Now, it's really interesting, that word gross, because in actual fact it's quite monstrous. Nearly half of all children in out-of-home care in Australia are ours, and yet we represent, as a child base, about 9% of the child population. There is something wrong with the data. It shouldn't take an economist to actually analyse that for us as Australians to be able to go, something is seriously wrong. But again, when we talk to what is going wrong, it's almost impossible. So when we talk about things like, and Travers leaned in on it, one of the pieces that we really fight hard for are our multifunctional, holistic wraparound early childcare services, early education and care services. Now, these services have been around since the 70s, and they basically said, government departments treat our children as if an arm and a leg live in a different department, in a different silo. But in actual fact, as First Nations people, we've always understood that our children sit within an ecosystem, which again speaks to that multi-dimensional measurement, the ability to drill in and see what is actually going on. But getting those services funded is like banging your head against a wall, because the ability to deliver a service that effectively has arms and legs in multiple departments is really, really difficult to do, when the KPIs used to measure success might be, how many Indigenous staff did you have in your building? Now, we certainly believe in Indigenous staff and we want to see as many of them as possible, but it won't tell you that there is no funding in order to be able to provide wraparound services, even for Aboriginal staff to be able to work in those facilities, particularly those ones that are in regional and remote areas where the challenges relating to housing and food security are massive, where the challenges related to being able to access higher education are almost insurmountable for really simple reasons like there's no internet technology available to you. There is a massive digital divide. There is no way for you to get into town because who's going to look after your children? And when you go into town, how on earth do you afford to take your family with you? Those types of things compound and compound and compound. And again, when I think about how we tell that story differently, often I turn to Uber drivers as oracles of the common man. Now, what Travers didn't mention is I'm from Alice Springs. That's my hometown. And what I would tell you is that Alice Springs is a beautiful community, a very complex, vibrant microcosm, and it is the home of my ancestors, my beautiful ancestors, which reminds me to make them known to the Wurundjeri mob here, as is always our custom, because my ancestors, when they meet their ancestors, want to know who they are. So they belong to the Central Aranda and Bundarinja, my mob are. And when I talk about that country, I talk to you about those incredible ranges that represent those incredible warriors, our caterpillars that went to war. They lost, they got killed by the beetles, and they lay there as the rangers, decapitated. So you've seen that gap? That is our decapitated caterpillars, but they are a massive warning that this is a country that is fought for. And you know you're coming into that country because of the incredible giant gum trees and that incredible whistling that they make as the wind blows through them, and the crunching of the rocks that are synonymous with that word, aranda, 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 our powerful elders and warriors. That is what I see when I go to Alice Springs, and yet most of you probably see the images of children on the streets, and this is a terrible narrative that affects our children. So speaking to one of the oracles of the common man, and I said to him, I'm from Alice Springs, and he says, oh, you poor thing. I said, why poor thing? And he goes, well, I've been to Alice Springs and I just don't understand. We give Aboriginal people so much money and we just keep giving them money, but I saw what they do with that money. They just drink. And I said to him, well, here's what I want to know. When you were looking at those people that you're talking about, did any of them have shoes on? He goes, oh, some of them. I said, those that had shoes on, were they brand names or did they look like maybe they came from Kmart? He said, oh, maybe they came from Kmart. I said, oh, did they have fancy clothes on, or did those clothes look like maybe they didn't have anywhere to sleep? And he said, oh, no, maybe they looked like they didn't have anywhere to sleep. I said, were they speaking English? He goes, no. I said, oh, was their hair brushed? No. I said, so maybe not only did they have nowhere to sleep, did they have nowhere to wash their clothes and nowhere to wash their bodies? And he said, oh, yeah. I said, do they look like they've ever had a job? And he said, no. I said, do they look like anyone was going to give them a job? He said, no. And I said, how much money do those people have? And he said, I never thought about it that way, but I was told they get $40 billion. $40 billion. And again, Danielle will tell you, you can potentially find that stat, but it is actually a red herring because that dollar figure relates to the number of dollars across everything. So, 3% of your submarine, 3% of, your every single hospital, that is actually what that dollar is. It doesn't actually talk to the dollars that are invested in our communities. So the ability to see that on screen, which is what you described in those figures for me, was a giant relief, and it means we're going to be able to tell a different story. Thank you.
The Arunta Warriors, beautiful, thank you. And Sabina, if we had time, the McDonnell Ranges in Alice is one of the most beautiful sites in Australia. Catherine, another question for you, if it's okay. So Sabina talked a lot tonight, but also in some of the briefings she's done about when countries decide to do multidimensional poverty measurement, there's a lot of conversation and co-design around the indicators that are chosen. And given your experience in a number of different respects with the Closing the Gap targets and the review, your insight on how to select those indicators in a way that is culturally appropriate and responsive to community sentiments and aspirations?
Oh, Travers, thank you for that question. Okay, this is really easy. You work with the communities that are affected by the policies that you're trying to work with. So when you talk about the 4 priority reform areas, and again, have to acknowledge the incredible work the Productivity Commission did in trying to look at what the data sets that would bring out the information that was showing the genuine commitment to shared decision-making, which is the heart of the national agreement. So you've all heard of Closing the Gap. Again, I'm going to tell you an Alice Springs story. When you talk about policy frameworks, they mean nothing to people on the ground. And in my country, our customs are still very, very much entrenched, particularly in our old people. So it's in living memory when mob would get dressed up in full ceremonial gear and come in and ask people like my grandfather for permission to enter. And today it's not done quite as dramatically as that, but old people will still come up and they'll ask for permission. Anyhow, this particular story relates to my Auntie Pat, who was the Deputy Administrator of the Northern Territory, very proud of that. And she said she got a knock at the door and our mob were in mourning, you know, sad face and head down. And she said, "Hey, why are you mob so sad?" And he goes, "My daughter, I heard that story for you traditional owners. They're going to close that gap." Now that is the gap that you enter through the ranges. That beautiful gap of our decapitated caterpillars. So again, that is what that means when you talk in that language to our mob. However, if you go and ask them what it is that they need, what it is that needs to change, they will give you that language. And the national agreement, which is the piece that I work on, which sits as the vehicle to drive the closing the gap responses, effectively went to as many communities as it could in the country. Every single community in the country identified the 4 priority reform areas. In amongst them, of course, shared decision making, access to data. Now, this is one, as Danielle will tell you, the people are really struggling with, because those data sets aren't data sets as we understand them today. They're data sets that can be built with the evidence that Sabina is bringing forward. And if those data sets were then developed in conjunction with the people who are living that experience, the depth that we could get on the national agreement and where we're genuinely getting change, where those investments are starting to hit the ground, would change fundamentally. Again, and one of the huge issues in when you look at the closing the gap targets and how awful they look, what you can see is in health, oh my goodness, we're starting to get some outcomes. They are the ones that have been invested in and they've been around longer. In children, not moving at all, and yet there are sparks of brilliance. But because our numbers are so small where that brilliance is, then it will take a whole system shift before you can actually see it. But working in conjunction with the national agreement, with those communities to say where are those shifts happening, and then being able to overlay it with a multidimensional measure that works on all the elements that are moving systemically, we're going to see a different picture. Again, if I could articulate it in an example, again, early education and care. An early education and care service on a remote community where there have been no jobs. All of a sudden there are jobs available and people can attend. Where there's been no access to internet technologies, guess what? They're embedded in the service. Where you haven't been able to talk to someone about how you access your Centrelink care payments, here is that ability to start engaging with it. You get a completely different measure. Where people were not able to enter a workforce, all of a sudden not only are there jobs in the centre, but they're able to think differently about the jobs that they can do in their communities. However, none of that's going to happen if you're not simultaneously investing into the healthcare services, ensuring that there's water available, ensuring that there's food available, ensuring that there's housing available, ensuring that there's adequate transport. And again, I'm going to take you down so many rabbit holes, I'm going to stop.
Thank you. Thanks, Catherine. So, Sabina, you've had a little bit of a break, so we'll come back to you. But given that Catherine's talked about the benefits of multidimensional measurement for children, and you touched on this in your oration, it would be wonderful if you can elaborate a bit more on where you've seen the benefits of MPIs for kids. And given what Catherine has said about the closing the gap targets, any particular standouts in terms of countries that have gone about the construction of their MPI in a really culturally sensitive and appropriate way?
Thank you so much. So children are captured to some extent in national MPIs in nearly every country. We keep a catalogue of the indicators that they use, and nearly every country disaggregates by children. And as I mentioned, usually children are statistically significantly poorer than adults or even than elderly people. And so it already captures something. But going beyond that, it's important to look across the life cycle of children, from the little ones at breast up to the teenagers 15 to 17, and to have age-appropriate indicators across the life cycle of children. But on the other hand, if you have one national measure, and it might have 7, 10, 15 indicators, and then you have another one for children, and policymakers aren't like me, they don't get up wanting to know about measurement and numbers every morning, so it becomes too complicated. So what most governments are doing is taking their national MPI and adding a dimension of childhood, scaling it back to the individual children, and having individual indicators for children across the life cycle of childhood, from breastfeeding or nutrition for the little ones, to things like early cognitive development, intellectual stimulation, preschool, school attendance, outcomes like that, up to not in employment, education, or training, early childhood, or early marriage, early childbearing. And that makes visible specific deprivations that strike different children in different contexts. And it often gives, unfortunately, much higher numbers of poverty. For example, in Sri Lanka, 17% of the population on average are poor, but among children it's 42%, a much higher number. But Sri Lanka wanted to make that visible. There's the political will and courage to do so. And so it really jump-started a lot of action because it was appropriate to context. In terms of cultural contexts, I think we are still at the beginning, and I think we have a lot to learn from different indicators, because the child MPIs to date have, even in Nigeria or the countries that are making them, they've used quite basic indicators that already exist because they wanted something quickly. And what we would like to do is work with different experts on childhood in different ways to think of what are the appropriate indicators of different communities of children.
Thank you. And maybe another part that you mentioned in your oration about poverty indicators as performance indicators and linking it to management, and you gave the example of Colombia. I mean, there are lots of senior officials from government and private sector leaders and community leaders here, and you gave examples as to how each of those communities have been involved in multidimensional measurement. It's quite a hopeful story about driving positive change and measuring that change along the way. Are there any other examples you can point to as to where multidimensional measures have been linked to management and linked to management expectations?
There are lots, so I don't know which to select. I'll just give a few examples. For example, whether it's Vietnam, whether it's Honduras, whether it's... many countries have sort of conditional benefits to certain population groups, and these traditionally were targeted using monetary measures, and now many countries are targeting using multidimensional as well as monetary. And so they can see exactly the deprivations that people are experiencing and offer the kinds of social support, but in an integrated way. Because what is important, which has come up already, is that often the services are requiring people to go to many different offices that they might qualify for. But the destitute people are the busiest people in the world. They have so much care, they have so much work, they must look for work, they must do the repairs and wash the clothes. And so they're time poor, and requiring them to go to all the government offices on top of that is quite a high difficulty. And so this work of consolidating services so that there's sort of a one-stop shop is very cost-effective. So there have been a number of UN studies that show that it's synergistic and more efficient and cost-effective to bring them together into an integrated package. But then it's also obviously much more friendly for the time poor among the poor.
Excellent. So we thought as a panel that, given it's a very serious topic and this is an after-dinner kind of conversations, we might just ask a couple of questions which are a little bit off the multidimensional poverty measures. But Catherine, Danielle, Sabina, you're all leaders and working on really important but often quite difficult issues. What do you each do to have fun, to relax?
I have a really suffering husband who takes multiple phone calls from me and multiple, again, the other oracle of truth, Instagram, where I come up with theories about the world and I share them. And I know that sounds really, really simple, but the truth of it is the ability to keep up this energy is really, really hard. And if I didn't have the opportunity to sit down on a couch and quite literally not move, but rather engage by sending ridiculous memes to my husband, I don't think I could relax, to be perfectly honest. It's my safe zone, and I'd love to say I was climbing mountains, but I'm not.
Look, I also love flopping on the couch, but look, for me, anything food-related, cooking, eating, I've just started making my own yogurt, which is surprisingly easy and delicious. I used to do crazy things like brew my own kombucha, and when my daughter was born, it was just like, oh, it's just one more thing to keep alive. I can't handle that right now, but so it's nice to return to being able to play with cultures. I also live on the beach, so I love paddleboarding, which is almost more meditation than anything. And my daughter's now 8 and old enough to have her own paddleboard, so we go out together, and it's a really lovely thing to do, although the Melbourne weather has not been cooperating for quite some time.
So our research centre gets together very seriously once a week, and it's on Tuesday at 11 for tea and cake. And my passion is baking. So I love to bake any kinds of, particularly sweets, but really exploring different recipes, different things. Now we have vegans, we have vegetarians, we have different kinds of allergies, and it's so much fun to find something we can all eat that's really delicious. And so we all are up to the challenge. And I also find the spiritual practice, the meditation, actually deeply relaxing, leisure, and joyous.
Excellent. So we're almost at time, but I want to ask Danielle and Catherine for one more comment, and I'd love each of you to kind of give we'll do two things. One is a parting message for this crowd, right, and who have all come because they're interested in the work that BSL does, but are particularly interested in measuring poverty and understanding what it might take to measure it properly and enable more Australians to live flourishing lives. So what's your message for this audience? And the second is, Sabina has 4 days left in Australia, one in Melbourne and a couple in Canberra, one in Sydney. Is there a must-visit place from your perspective while Sabina's still in town?
All right, so look, I think the takeaway message is pretty clear. I think it is time. We agreed on a measure. Sabina has made the case for having dual measures. I would say let's agree on a monetary measure quickly. I think the work is largely there, and we should be able to bed something down pretty quickly. I think the multidimensional piece is a much longer conversation. It needs to be culturally appropriate, and part of the benefit of it is actually having that conversation and working out what goes in and how you weight things. But I think we can run a dual track on this. Sabina, head down to St Kilda Beach. You can hire a paddleboard, go along the coastline. It's incredibly beautiful. I'd also recommend the Ian Potter Gallery, which is right here at Federation Square. Amazing collection of Australian art, particularly Indigenous art, which is really incredible. Canberra, I just work the whole time. You can walk around the lake. It's very nice.
So I'm going to, in terms of what you should do while you're here, very much leaning into that. So while I'm very good at sending inappropriate means to my long-suffering husband, I am a keen runner, and every morning when I'm in Melbourne, I run along St Kilda Beach from Elwood Beach to Port Melbourne and then back again. And I do that so I can talk to the ancestors. And our ancestors, even here in this country too, they will tell you, you will find them near the water. So given that you like to meditate, I would strongly encourage you to find whatever part of the environment around you that you sense that they are there, and take a moment and talk to them. Take a moment to hear their stories, because they will speak to you. So I think that will come to you as you explore. You know, that moment will come to you when it's right. But in terms of a last message, how much time do I have? I'm going to try to be really quick, right? I'm going to try to be really quick. I'm not very good at it. My Nana was one of the most gifted storytellers ever, and one of the ways that we traditionally taught our children how to be in this world, and absolutely noting that in those measures you've spoken about, Sabina, was the ability to understand what brings wellness to our families, how do we connect spiritually, and how important is that. So the way we did it on My Country was called Money Money. And the storyteller would sit at the front of the crowd, and the children would sit all around it, and the storyteller would bring these leaves to life, and she might look at it and go, "Bye, look at this leaf. Oh, geez, he's handsome." And then she'd bring up another leaf and she'd go, "Bye, geez, look at this leaf. No, you can't marry him. You got to marry this person over here. He's too handsome for you." Now, these stories were often very inappropriate, by the way. Got a theme going here. But and then the next one would come up and he'd go, "Yeah, I think I'm a little short person like you. I should marry you." And then the tall person would say, "Oh yeah, Auntie, I saw that person first. She's my wife. I don't care if you say she's not level. Anyhow, the story would go on until someone would try and steal that husband. And the result of that would be that person would get into a lot of trouble and get hunted away. And the children with the big eyes would sit there and they would listen and they would engage and they would cry and they would laugh. And at the end of it, they would be very, very sad because someone behaved the wrong way. And that would change the way they looked at how you behave in your own society. And these stories could be applied to anything, but they would laugh and they would cry and they would dance. What I know from that experience is that at any time, the most powerful person in the room is the person who tells the story. So if I was to lean into Sabina's message, and that is the one of hope, my hope is when you tell the story, you tell the right story, and you realise that every single one of you has incredible power when you have the opportunity to tell it. Thank you.
Oh, well, what a wonderful conversation, what a wonderful message to finish on. Look, as Stephen said earlier in his introduction, the Sambell Oration is really about opening up space for conversations about critical issues of social justice in Australia and around the world. And Sabina, Catherine and Danielle, you've certainly done that for us tonight, and you build on a history of wonderful orations over the years. So thank you. I just want to offer a few words of reflection before we hand back to our MCs and to some more brilliant performances. Last year we did have the Treasurer deliver the oration, and as Stephen mentioned, his focus was about hard heads and warm hearts. It was about the Measuring What Matters framework. But the argument that he made in July last year was that responsible economic management and compassion can be complementary, not contradictory. And that night we spoke about how the elimination of poverty could be the fourth point on Australia's economic compass, alongside employment, inflation and growth. In the same way we speak about inflation or GDP and where the numbers are going, reduction of poverty should really be a core part of Australia's economic story, the story that our policymakers and those right across our society, from business, community, sector and others, want to tell and help to guide our decisions about our economy and about our society. And tonight, and the reason why we asked Sabina Alkire to deliver the oration tonight is she's shown really powerfully and vividly how that can be done, and done in a really sensitive and appropriate way that combines the simplicity of a monetary measure with something that helps us to understand why people are poor and impoverished and what can be done. Unstacking or restacking the odds, as Sharon Goldfield might say. I can see over there at one of the tables. Danielle, you've helped us to learn about just how critical this issue is in Australia right now, given the Productivity Commission's recent work. And thank you for joining the case for official measures. One simple that we can do immediately. I think Sam Reinhart can work on that with others, but one that might take more time and co-design. And Catherine, you've painted a really wonderful picture of what this story and the multidimensional approach might mean for First Nations children and families, but also for the broader early years approach in this country, helping to meet children and families and households where they are and what might help them to live flourishing lives that they aspire to. One of the big opportunities we see in Sabina's approach and the way that it's used in hundreds of countries around the world, and around 60 odd that are thinking about bespoke measures for their own countries, is the way in which an MPI, a multidimensional poverty index, can become a KPI for government. And we do think that it should be a performance expectation for government, what their position on poverty is, how ambitious they are in wanting to prevent it and to alleviate it. And we've heard in Sabina's address lots of examples of how this has been done in a really hopeful, positive, enabling way. And we've heard about how the best approach to poverty measurement combines two things, an income measure and a multidimensional measure. The two together give us a simple, clear and actionable picture of how to move forward as a society and how we can improve the lives of the most vulnerable in our community. In the lead up to the federal election, which is just around the corner, could be any time but needs to be before next May, we hope that all candidates and parties that are standing for office do articulate how they intend to shift the dial on poverty in this country, given that we've heard only last month, unofficially, from the Productivity Commission, based on their assessment, that our poverty rate in 2022 was the highest since 2001, which should concern any country, but particularly one of the wealthiest countries in the world. We know there's a huge appetite across the community for doing this and for doing it properly. From government, from the community sector, from business. Recent polling and research has shown that over 80% of Australians want the federal government to measure and report on poverty, and that 90% of Australians agree that no Australian deserves to live in poverty. So we know that the community sentiment is there, and 50 years on next year, from the release of the Henderson Review, we hope there can be a commitment to official poverty measures. I just want to finish with a huge thank you. There'll be thanks later on, but a big thank you from me to all of my colleagues in the room for the wonderful work they do every day to inject confidence and capability and connection right across communities, and for being such legends. And to all of you for your partnership, for your support, for your encouragement in the work that we do together, and the work that you're all doing in your various fields. You can see, and I've been asked to say this, so I will follow these instructions, but you can see some of BSL's work over the last 12 months in our most recent annual report, which is hot off the press and is on our website, and I think there are copies around tonight. And we've got more work to do over the coming days with Sabina in town to bring to life our purpose, which is to advance a fair Australia through our leadership on policy reform, our partnerships with communities and the quality of our services. And we hope that you'll join us in that quest, and hopefully next time we come together, there's a formal commitment to officially measuring poverty in this country. So with that, would you please give our wonderful panel and 2024 orator another round of applause?